Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today I have the great pleasure of welcoming back to the channel Dr. Dennis MacDonald. How are you, Dennis?
I'm fine, thank you, Esoteric.
So
Pleasure
Dennis,
to be back.
yes, thank you. So the news, your book has hit. Please talk to us about this new book that you've just put out.
It was published only December 6th. It's available only from me and from Amazon, but its cost has really come down to the cost of publication. In dollars, it's about $22, which is amazing for a book that's 570 pages. Let me begin by saying I was for a long time unhappy with English synopses of the Gospels. And I set out my task during the COVID years to create a reference work that anybody could use for the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles that compensates for shortcomings in other English synopses, but also makes a contribution that's unique. And I'll talk about what that is. The name of the book is Synospses of Epic, Tragedy, and the Gospels. And what makes it unique is its emphasis on the Homeric epics and Athenian tragedy. The problem with previous synopses, in my view, is that the Gospels were presented in canonical order, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and not in chronological order, which would be Mark, Matthew, Luke, Acts, and John. Another is that it didn't take into account what scholars call the Q document, or a lost gospel that informed at least Matthew and Luke, and I think Mark as well. Another shortcoming is that it treated the Gospel of John the same way that they do the synoptics. Whereas the Gospel of John presents its own problems and it has its own three-stage compositional history. So those can be actually compared in a synopsis the same way that one would compare the synoptic Gospels. The other big shortcoming, esoteric, is that the Gospel of Luke was detached from the Acts of the Apostles, so that to understand the literary accomplishment and theology of the author of the Gospel of Luke, one needs somehow to incorporate the Acts of the Apostles. So that's what I set out to do. Now, every verse of the Gospels in the New Testament is present. Every word is present in my synopsis. And one can use it as an alternative to any English synopsis of the Gospels that's available there, and it compensates for the shortcomings. Of course, people who are more scholarly and know Greek should consult Greek editions, because I do not do much with textual variants. I don't do too much with Greek grammatical constructions and so on. So it's basically for people who read English, who are interested, and this is worldwide, who are interested in the Gospels in their larger literary context. The other thing about previous synopses, of course, is they don't include any literature that's not written by Christians or Jews. So there are parallels to the Hebrew Bible, there are parallels to some patristic authors and to apocryphal Gospels, but not to the most important literature in the world of the New Testament, namely the Homeric epics, Athenian tragedies, the Plato's Socratic dialogues, and the Aeneid of Virgil, written in Latin. And so I spend quite a bit of time dealing with those parallels. But there's another piece of it, esoteric, that people may need to be aware of. Byzantine intellectuals and some medieval Greek intellectuals saw the parallels between the Gospels and Homer, and they rewrote the Gospel stories by using lines from Homer, or sometimes made into prose. And these are called the Homerocentones. That is, they're stitchings together of Homeric lines to retell the story of the life of Jesus. And in many cases, they target the very texts from Homer that inspired the works in the first place. The Gospel of Nicodemus begins, the first edition has extensive imitations of Euripides' Bacchae. And then when it gets rewritten in medieval Greek, it's in prose of the death and burial of Jesus that you have that parallels the death and burial of Hector at the end of the Iliad. So this work, Esoteric, is not intended to be an argument. It's not intended to be an attack on the Christian religion, although some people have used my work to make it do so. It is not that. It's a reference work. It's an encyclopedia, if you will. It's the phone book that anybody interested in the gospel should read when they want to look up something. So my suggestion to the reader, and this is to you too, because you haven't had a chance to read it yet, is just to read the first 20 pages, the introduction, what it's trying to accomplish, and then I actually give an overview of the book in those first 20 pages, so you understand where the document is going. And then there's a very dense, scientific, methodological prolegomenon that deals with the critical issues that are involved with the synoptic problem, with the reconstruction of Q, with how parallels to Greek poetry work, and so on. And that is really for the specialist. So I think after reading the first 20 pages, what you ought to do, Esoteric, is take a look at some of your more popular narratives in the New Testament, which you've already done, the Gerasene demoniac, or the woman who anoints Jesus for burial, or the death of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, and so on. And just take a look and make your own judgments about what kind of parallels there might be. And there are lots of ways of thinking about it. My way of thinking about it is called mimesis. That is, it's intentional literary imitation. But it also could be that the Homeric stories, say, are so popular in the culture that people remember the stories and they tell them as they remember them. It's also possible that you have some deep structures in the way people tell stories. And so we have fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman is like a Polyphemus story of a young man who's trying to escape a giant and make wealth. So there are lots of ways of explaining these parallels, but there's no way of escaping these parallels. And that's what this document attempts to do. So let me read what the 3 subtitles are to the book. So again, the title is Synopses of Epic Tragedy in the Gospels. There's nothing in any language ever been written that attempts to do these things. Volume 1. Mimetic synopsis of 4 synoptic gospels. It includes my reconstruction of Q, and then goes to Mark, Matthew, and Luke Acts. And these are imitations of Deuteronomy, Homer, and Athenian tragedies. Volume 2 is mimetic syncresis of the Acts of the Apostles. That is, it's not a synopsis, it's a syncresis, it's comparison. Imitations of Homer and Euripides in rivalry with the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid, which also imitates these texts. Volume 3, mimetic synopsis of the 3 Gospels of John, and the subtitle, Imitations of the Synoptics and Euripides' Bacchae. I am so proud of this work. It's my Lebensarbeit, as they say in German. It's my life work. And it distills lots of the material that I have in other books. I give cross-references to them, but I think this is enough to stimulate people to make their own judgments about how beautiful these texts are when they're read in the context of the Greek mythological poetry that informed their culture. So anyway, that's my introduction to it. I have some wonderful endorsements, but that sounds like it's too arrogant. So there you have it.
Feel free to read any of the endorsements. Go for it.
Go for it?
Yeah, go for it.
This is from Christine de Troyer, who's the secretary of the European Academy of Arts and Sciences and teaches Hebrew Bible at the University of Salzburg, Austria. If there's one scholar who has opened our eyes to the evangelists and other early Christian authors imitating classical literature, it is Dennis MacDonald. The 3 volumes that comprise Synospses of Epic, Tragedy, and the Gospels are the result of lifelong stellar research into direct and strategic imitations of classical poetry, especially Homer, Virgil, and Euripides. More profoundly, here he abundantly demonstrates the literary indebtedness of the evangelist text not written by Jews or Christians, and thereby shows that he has been way ahead of his time. These volumes are indispensable for anyone studying the New Testament within its Greco-Roman context. So there are others, but that should do it.
As we discussed previously and on a number of occasions, the channel tends to attract a lot of theists who can't get their head around, well, one, the content on the channel, but in particular, what in your comparison between the Homeric epics and the Gospels, what would you say to especially the pastors who struggle with understanding your work, and as much as they try to be very defensive and dismiss your work, what would you say to those individuals?
First of all, esoteric, I'd want to tell them that the mythologies in the New Testament, though extensive, are not the entire story. My work has been used by mythicists who say that Jesus himself was mythological. I would never say that. In fact, I'm a big fan of the historical Jesus. And I'm also a big fan of the Q document, which is the earliest version of Jesus's life that we have. I call it the Logoi of Jesus, which likely was its original title. And there you have a Jewish author praising Jesus for having an alternative understanding of Mosaic law that accounts for, that makes the law applicable to the socially marginal, to the poor and women and so on. So in that document is where we get the statement in Matthew and actually in all 3 synoptics, I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. The story of Jesus forgiving the sinful woman, which is in late text of the Gospel of John, probably was in the Q document, where Jesus is violating Mosaic law in order to protect a woman from men who want to stone her. So the first thing I'd like to say to my pastor friends, and by the way, I live in a retirement community that is related to the United Church of Christ, and I am a Christian identified atheist. And I mean that, both of them. I don't believe that there's a God, but I am enthralled with the Christian message and the way it can be used importantly. Unfortunately, the Christian church has focused on its narratives, with narratives that are generated in competition with the narratives of Greek mythology, especially in Homer. So we just had the Christmas season, And the Christmas story in Luke is a redoing of the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, where Aphrodite tells Anchises that she's going to bear him a son, and he will have an eternal empire, and so on. The Eastertide is the death of Jesus. The death of Jesus in Mark is crafted after the death of Hector that appears at the end of the Iliad. Other famous stories, Lazarus and Dives in Hades, is a retelling of Odysseus going to the netherworld and seeing Tantalus, who can never get satisfaction from water. And the story goes on and on. And so these are the narratives that have kind of created the Christian worldview. Well, I didn't even mention the resurrection stories, how important that is for Easter. So, but there's so much more to say. Now, where does this motivation for mythology come from? It comes from Christian intellectuals. It doesn't come from fishermen. It comes from Christian intellectuals in a span of about 50 years, probably from around 75 to 125, something like that. And they're trying to locate the Christian message in the context of Greco-Roman religion. Oops, my phone's going off. In the context of Greco-Roman religion, and to show that Jesus is more compassionate or more powerful or more redemptive than the heroes of the Greeks. And it's a way of carving out their social identity, the same way that Virgil carved out the social identity of the Roman Empire by imitating the Homeric epics. So these stories can be understood in their own time, the same way that many Christians want to talk about themselves as contemporary, as different from their surroundings, and to emphasize compassion and liberation and so on. And these are topics of the narratives. But these narratives that come out of Greek mythology are simply probably the least important pieces of the Gospels. At least they, by numbers, they're really quite small. They do not include parables. They do not include the Sermon on the Mount. They do not include ethical instructions. They do not include prophecies. They do not include prayers. They do not include moral instruction. So much of what we find in the Gospels cannot be attributed to Greek mythology. It actually comes out of Judaism and an interest in redefining Jewish law. And this is what the Pauline mission is, isn't it, Esoteric? To get to make the history of the canonical past of Judaism work for Gentiles, and to soften certain restrictions of the law so that it is more embracive and culturally diverse. So these are some projects that a modern Christian church often identifies with. So the nice thing about my new book is that it's not an argument against the Christian tradition at all. It's a phone book. It's a reference work when people want to. My experience, my career was in a Christian seminary. I tried to help pastors understand the New Testament, and not just the Gospels, but also Paul and whatever. But what I wanted them to do, and when they prepare a sermon, is to take into account not just Jewish texts, but Greco-Roman texts. And often they would see that the Greco-Roman texts are more enlightening and closer. The same thing is true with teaching, let's say, Sunday school classes to teenagers. Teenagers love the Homeric stories, and they get exposed to them in American high schools, at least. And now they see that their own religious tradition is playing off of that and they can make their own judgments about which of the heroes that they like the best. So I would say to your pastor friends or foes, or however you want to understand them, that this material is really somewhat neutral with respect to the truths that Christians want to hold to. I think it prevents the church from making really stupid judgments about walking on water and Jesus speaking to the dead and having insights into the nature of the netherworld. So yes, it is groundbreaking. Yes, I understand why it's going to be threatening to some people, but it also can be enlightening to people. So that would be my response.
I think that I think your work is misunderstood by especially fundamentalists and apologetics. I'd like to read a quote, something that you've said to me on 2 occasions. You're not against religion, you are against bad and stupid religion. Can you expand on that and just clarify that for those out there?
How much art has been generated from the Christian myth? How much wonderful music has been generated from the Christian myth? How much liberation has come from the preaching of the gospel, or and so on? I live with people all the time who have devoted themselves to mission, often in education or in health or in agriculture. And they're motivated to do so because they found something in their texts and in their community that sustained them in doing the right. Now, of course, we also know that religion has been a cause of much not only hardship, but murder and warfare. And that the divisions of religion is a great tragedy in modern world. And we need to be attentive to those things. And I also know that right now, many Christian communities are concerned about the environment and are looking for insights and energy to address the climate crisis that we're in. So why should anyone be against these social groups that are trying to do such good? But I'd also, there's a lot of, I would say, anti-scientific mentality in Christian religion, especially fundamentalism, suspicion of science, suspicion of evolution, suspicion of experts like myself. I'm simply a scientist working in ancient texts. And people resent authority sometimes, or experts. And we need to get over that. We need to embrace education. We need to embrace research and intelligence and go where the truth leads us. And the church has not been very good at that sometimes.
In looking at Jesus competing with Dionysus in the 4th gospel, and Odysseus or Hector and Hector competing, and Odysseus competing with Hector, as in the Gospel of Mark, or with Socrates, as one finds in Luke and Acts. Why did each author of the Gospel have their own hero that they were basing the story on?
Let's start with the Gospel of John, which is the first one you mentioned, and it's the last of the Gospels. I'm convinced that the author of the earliest version of the Gospel of John, because there probably were 3 editions, the earliest one, knew the synoptic Gospels. But in the synoptic Gospels, Jesus is a loser. He dies on a cross, and he also demands difficult discipleship from his followers, Take up your cross and follow me. Sell your goods and give to the poor, and you shall lay up treasure in heaven. You may lose houses and so on, and hate your family and so on, but you'll have eternal reward. So there's a harshness to the Jesus of the Gospels. But the author of the fourth Gospel apparently is living in a group in connection with Dionysian religion. And in Dionysian religion, Dionysus gives life. He gives wine. He gives good sex. He is the donor deity. And you have another donor deity, Demeter or Demeter, who supplies the grains. So what we find in the fourth gospel is a Jesus who also gives gifts. The prologue of the gospel says Jesus gives, the Logos gives gift after gift. His first miracle is a Dionysian miracle, to turn water into wine. He meets the woman at the well and he gives her living water, like a Maenad in Dionysus. You can have eternal life if you eat Jesus's flesh and drink his blood. And Jesus's final words at the cross are not despair. He's not a loser. He's a victor. He says, "Tetelestai," it is finished. It has been accomplished. So that Jesus is a competitor for the Jewish community with Dionysus to say that Jesus too gives gifts. He doesn't just give a cross. He doesn't just give poverty, as you have in the synoptics. So I think the Gospel of John reads differently because it lives in a different, the author lives in a different culture, in which is to make Jesus competitive with Dionysus as giving good gifts. Okay, so that's one piece. Now let's talk about Paul and to some extent Jesus as philosophers in the Gospel of Luke. Luke is competing with Virgil's Aeneid to say that Jesus is superior to Aeneas. And one thing Aeneas is not is a philosopher. He's a good fighter. He's a great family man. He founds an empire. He has the favors, he has a divine parent. Venus is his parent, but he's not a philosopher. And what Luke is interested in doing is taking the narrative of the Gospel of Mark, and in my view, also Matthew, and creating Jesus as a Socrates-like character who dies heroically, is not afraid of death, offers eternal life to those who die with him as the righteous thief. And then Paul becomes a philosopher. So what does Paul do early on or in the middle of the Acts of the Apostles? He goes to Athens. He talks about the unknown God. He gives a speech on metaphysics and Jesus's role in that, although he doesn't mention the name Jesus. And from then on, he gives apologiae, that he gives apologies, that is, defenses of his ministry and the philosophical sophistication of it. So Socrates became really a marvelous model for Jesus also in the patristic world. So that we have in the Acts of Andrew, for example, heavy Platonism that the Apostle Andrew speaks. You have it also in the Acts of John, to some extent in the Acts of Thomas. So that's what you have with the Socrates thing. Now, with the Homer thing, with the Odysseus thing, the thing that's wonderful is Odysseus can't wait to get home. He travels with people who are his inferiors, and he's able to suffer and suffer and suffer in order to reach his end. And of course, writing after the Jewish war, the gospel author Mark is interested in issues of suffering because he's seen so much of it. And to have Odysseus, who can suffer so much and yet come back and be victorious, is a wonderful image. But of course, he's got to narrate the death of Jesus too. And for that, Hector is so wonderful. Hector is the great defender of Troy. He too is a great family man. His father loves him so much that he carries a ransom to Achilles in order to get the body back to Troy for a fitting burial, which is like Joseph of Arimathea daring to go to Pilate to ask for the body for a fitting burial. So the author of Mark, in this case, found in Odysseus a suffering hero that works for his community after the Jewish war. And he finds in the Iliad the death of Hector, which is a fitting model for the death, the heroic death of a character. So that I hope that's an answer that you were looking for, something like that.
That is. And you touched on the Gospel of Nicodemus. I think it's important for people to understand that the myths in the Gospels are not solely attributable to the Gospels. There are non-canonical books that are also based on mythology. Can you touch on that, please?
Oh, the Acts of Andrew is an amazing document. The name Andrew means manliness. So he's a heroic character. In the Gospels, he's one of the 4 fishermen who Jesus calls to be his disciples. And so Andrew is also a sailor. He's on the sea and has frequently, and he tours around like Odysseus. And over and over and over again, the author appeals to Greek mythology, and he advertises it esoteric by means of significant names. So these names trigger characters that people would know from classical mythology. And Andrew, in these cases, always is more powerful, more compassionate, or wiser than his competitors, so that these stories all have a syncresis. And the syncresis is between Andrew and these characters of classical mythology in order to show that Jesus is superior. Now, the other thing about the Acts of Andrew is there's not a single biblical Hebrew Bible allusion. There's no quotation. This is the world at the end of the 2nd century, around the year 190 in Egypt, where someone is writing about the Apostle Andrew that is either ignorant or not interested in the Jewish Bible. So that all of the mythological parallels are coming from Greek poetry or philosophy. And by the way, a lot of Plato there too. So I encourage people to look at the Acts of Andrew. It's a great read, and it'll be a test of your ability to understand Greek poetry.
Dr. MacDonald, thank you for your time today on Esoteric Thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Esoteric. This was a pleasure.